The 1920s continued from the textbook, and the first two, or these two IDs, will be on the Roaring Twenties, which is the nickname of the 1920s, and the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh. Okay, so the nickname of the era of the 1920s was the Roaring Twenties, and mostly referring to dance and music and uh, lifestyle, jazz music, new dances, new, definitely new fashions. So the Roaring Twenties was a time of new haircuts, new dances. Like I said earlier, the era of the lost generation of writers. Some of the famous dances of the time were the Charleston. So the Roaring Twenties, famous for very big changes in fashion, music, hairstyles. Like I said, the Charleston, bob haircuts, wild dances, and much of this in the speakeasies and uh, the secret taverns and bars of the era. Jazz music, you had the famous Louis Armstrong, many new comedians. Though it was a very interesting era. It's called the Roaring Twenties. A very famous person of this era was Charles Lindbergh, famous for his accomplishments as a pilot. He certainly became one of the most famous pilots in world history, even to now. Lindbergh was born in 1902 and died in 1974. Charles Lindbergh was the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, which is a monumental feat. That's a 5,000-mile trip, and no one. Others had tried, but died trying. And Lindbergh made his plan to fly from New York to Paris. A little bit about his early years. He started actually as a flight student and took lessons to become a pilot. After he successfully learned how to fly, he had many jobs as a pilot, delivering packages and many other jobs. But then he became interested in what was a big goal of pilots at the time, and that would be to be the first to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And so he got some people to finance that trip and try, and a plane was built, and the name of the plane was called the Spirit of St. Louis. And then he attempted his flight in 1927. So he did it. He flew across the ocean in this kind of bizarre looking airplane that we just saw that had basically hardly very few windows, used mirrors sometimes to see what was in front of him because it had to be loaded with some. The big problem was having enough fuel to make it, but it made it, and it barely made it. But it made it as he ran out of gas just as he got to Paris. And like the headline says, it took 33 hours, and news of this was broadcast on the radio and the newspapers, and so he became world famous. And a very large crowd was waiting at the airport during his successful landing. So headlines like this were in newspapers across the country and even the world. And it made him, like it says, a very famous celebrity as having been the first to fly across the Atlantic. This is one of the largest attended parades in United States history in celebration of the successful flight. When Lindbergh got back to the United States, they had this large parade for him. So as time went by, he became less famous. Um, Unfortunately, in the end, he had some very big problems in his personal life. The biggest was his child or his baby was kidnapped a few years later and died in a kidnapping and killed. So it was a very sad ending for one of the most famous people in U.S. history.